Good evening. My name is Scott Kratz. I'm the Vice President of Education here at the National Building Museum. And for those who are joining us for the first time, let me start off by letting you know that the Building Museum was created by an act of Congress in 1980 and housed in this historic pension building. We're a private nonprofit whose mission is to advance the quality of the built environment by educating the public about its impact on people's lives. Chief among those issues is community development and an exploration of our urban environments, topics that we're going to be talking about this evening. The museum is proud to provide a neutral forum for dialogue on these critical issues. Tonight is the third and final program in a three-part series that explores how arts and cultural institutions in infrastructure, libraries, museums, parks, concert halls, can create a critical mass of culture with the potential to redefine both the physical character and the civic identity of those communities. I'm especially looking forward to this evening's program. This series is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Arts and McGraw-Hill Construction. We'd like to thank them both for their support. Now, on to tonight's program. This program is entitled Industry to Art, which will explore how cities are working hard to reinvent themselves as they struggle with lost manufacturing jobs and a changing global economy. Municipalities are using the arts to rebrand themselves as cultural hubs, attracting not only artists themselves, but also young and upwardly mobile workers who value creative communities. This panel will explore small and medium-sized cities across the United States that are transforming aging factories into art galleries, creating large interdisciplinary cultural districts, taking over abandoned lots or even homes for art creation, and producing annual cultural events to draw outside visitors. Each speaker will give a short presentation about their work, about 5 or 10 minutes, and this will be followed by moderated discussion, and then we'll conclude with Q&A from you all. So our speakers tonight, in this order, will be Kevin McMahon, who is in his 11th year as president and CEO of the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust, an artist economic development nonprofit organization responsible for creating and operating an arts entertainment district in a 14-city block of downtown Pittsburgh. The $50 million operating budget operates 8 performance spaces, 6 art galleries, and numerous outdoor plazas and real estate properties totaling in excess of 1 million square feet. The Pittsburgh Cultural Trust presents approximately 1,600 performances, attracting more than 2 million visitors annually. Previously, Kevin was right here in Washington, D.C. as the executive vice president of the Kennedy Center for 9 years. He was the vice president of the New School in New York City and serves on a number of boards and councils. He's an adjunct professor for the Heinz School of Management at Carnegie Mellon University, and he holds an MBA from the City University in New York and an undergraduate degree of economics and psychology from Hiram College. Our second speaker this evening will be Joseph Biondo, who was born in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, that we're going to be hearing more about this evening, and graduated from Kansas State University. Shortly after graduation, he pursued a lengthy career with the film Boland, Sawinski, Jackson Architects, where he worked closely with gold medal recipient Peter Boland. In 1996, he established Joseph N. Biondo Architects before joining Spillman Farmer Architects, where he is today. His architecture is recognized for its ties to regional traditions. His work celebrates the process of making and is deeply influenced by his family background, which is rooted in both the garment and construction industries. He was born and our third speaker today was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. Gina Reichert holds a Master's of Architecture degree from Cranbrook Academy of Art and Tulane University, and has worked for architecture firms and community organizations in Cincinnati, New Orleans, New York, and Detroit. She founded Detroit 99 with partner Mitch Cope in 2007 to investigate new models of contemporary art and architectural practice. Embedded in a residential corner of Detroit, Design 99 seeks out opportunities to experiment with art and design within the community. In 2010, they founded Powerhouse Productions, a nonprofit organization focused on neighborhood stabilization through art and culture. As co-director of Powerhouse Productions, she's brought numerous investment dollars into her Detroit neighborhood, including grants from the Tony Hawk Foundation, the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts, and a 2012 Art Place grant. And our moderator this evening is Candace Damon, who is vice chairman of HR&A Advisors. Candace has devoted her 30-year career to crafting sustainable urban redevelopment strategies for cities and agencies across North America. Her specific areas of expertise include leading organizational planning for nonprofits and institutions, ensuring the long-term viability of urban open spaces, supporting master planning efforts for large-scale revitalizations, and addressing the financial challenges of making commercial and multifamily residential buildings energy efficient. Her experience leading arts and cultural development projects include the creation of arts districts in Brooklyn and Greensboro, a current assignment assessing the feasibility of creating a summer venue for the New York Philharmonic, growth planning for Longwood Gardens, planning for the revitalization of PV Plaza on behalf of the Minnesota Orchestral Association, and repositioning of the Atlanta Civic Center campus. She holds a BA from Amherst College and a JD from Harvard Law School. We'll start this evening with Kevin. Kevin?
Thanks very much, Scott. Since Scott already gave my speech, you don't have to know anything else about us, and I want to apologize in advance because some of my colleagues put a video into the middle of this PowerPoint presentation, which is going to be a little repetitive. I promise I'll be done in less than 10 minutes. However, probably a few of you have been to Pittsburgh before, but we wanted to make sure that we were telling people where we were and where the cultural district was all about. If I can get this to start rolling at some point. Maybe not. While we're getting a little technical help here, I wanted to give you 4 takeaways from my talk. One is that it does take leadership, very important. 2, that the private-public partnerships are very much about what we are talking about tonight, the importance of money, and particularly in Pittsburgh's case, the importance of foundation money, and finally, the unusual use of real estate in terms of creating a cultural district like Pittsburgh. These folks are going to give you a quick 2-minute or 3-minute talk about what we all now want to hear about the culture.
You know, the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust is one of the greatest gifts that Pittsburgh's ever been given. In the early days, downtown was not a very vibrant place. It was pretty dirty, actually, and the cultural district really was a red light district.
It's a 14 square block area of downtown, and at one end of the district was the David L. Lawrence Convention Center, and at the other end of the district was Heinz Hall. But between Heinz Hall and the Convention Center was a section of the downtown that most people were genuinely afraid to go into. Jack Heinz had a vision of how to solve that problem, and that was to create a cultural district around Heinz Hall, to provide more venues for the performing arts and provide more foot traffic into that portion of downtown.
My father-in-law saw a cultural district as an example of a physical renaissance that would involve the entire city. He saw the tremendous possibilities in breaking old molds and going in a totally different direction than the convention rules dictated.
From the beginning of planning for the cultural district, the process was holistic. It focused not only on how to provide more venues and more support for the performing arts organizations that could use the facilities, on how to enhance the streetscaping and the architecture of the district, and how to develop parks and plazas. It was to create an area of downtown that was eminently attractive.
We redid the Bayou, we built the O'Reilly, we built the Michael Graves parking garage, we built some of the beautiful parks down there. We bought a whole series of buildings and regenerated the facades and leased them out. The Cultural Trust basically took the worst part of town and made it a great part of town.
And the particular theme that we're celebrating here is a vision that's coordinated, that has partnerships, has courage and energy, and moves ahead. And I think these are the hallmarks of what I think is very, very Pittsburgh, very special to this place. And I'm proud to be associated with it.
All the great leaders of the past, Jack Heinz and his band of dreamers, and Carol Brown, the first president, built a great cultural district. The Cultural Trust's job today is to make sure that the cultural district is attractive as a destination to as many people as possible. We want to have the widest variety of arts and entertainment possible to make this a place not only for great entertainment, but also a great place to live, work, as well as play. So I wasn't exaggerating, that literally these are not from 50 or 60 years ago. These photographs are literally 20 years ago in downtown Pittsburgh. This is really what it looked like. And just remarkable transformation that took place. A lot of this took place because of the support that we received from foundations and corporations and others that were helping us. I think we're stuck again on this slide because it's so exciting. I'm going to ask for some assistance again because it seems to not be focusing. One of the things that I wanted to mention is the unusual use of real estate. Many, many arts organizations are aware that the arts don't pay for themselves, and I'm sure many of you in this room understand that. The founders, Jack Hines and his so-called Band of Dreamers, which you heard about a moment ago, decided that if we could purchase the surrounding real estate, which so happens to be the same real estate that you saw a moment ago with XXX uses, we could go ahead and, in the beginning, use those properties to generate revenue. So we took many, many adjacent spaces, adjacent to the performing arts centers that we created, and repurposed them for other uses, adapted them to the uses that you see here on the screen. We also looked at the surrounding district. So on one side of the district was the Allegheny River, not terribly appealing. We created a little parklet along the river to encourage people. We also built a few new buildings that provide income. And finally, we decided that we wanted to have more people live downtown. When the Cultural Trust began, there were fewer than 2,000 residents in the entire downtown of Pittsburgh. Now they're close to 10,000 residents. And that's really just within the last 20 years. We continue to see new development taking place. Some of our new facilities, the Education Center and the new August Wilson Center, have been created. And we've spent a lot of time working with all of the arts organizations to remind people that it's the district, not just the ballet, not just the opera, not just the Cultural Trust, but it's all of the things that are going on here. The thousands of people that we're bringing downtown, and all for the betterment of the economic development that we have going on in the downtown Pittsburgh area. One of the things that also is, I think, critically important, and I hope we can get to talk a little bit about this, is how you get a group of people to cooperate together. And that is one of the more important takeaways, at least for me, even to this day, where we try to get arts organizations, some of whom, of course, are very independent-minded, which we like. That's what the arts are all about, right? Independent-minded people. But we have to get them to work together collaboratively to create a cultural district that works together. So thank you all very much.
My name is Joe Biondo. I thank you so much for having me here. Pittsburgh and Bethlehem have some similarities, both industrial powerhouses in the early 1900s. In fact, Bethlehem opened up to compete directly against Pittsburgh, and now both cities are flourishing wonderfully. I'm going to talk about Bethlehem with the Arts Quest Center, a performing arts district on the former Bethlehem Steel site. I'm also going to talk about the Lehigh Valley in general. The Lehigh Valley is comprised of Allentown, Bethlehem, and Easton, cities, small-sized cities that come together. Their boundaries are connected, and approximately 700,000 diverse in population resides there. And this was an industrial powerhouse at one time. You had garment industry, silk mills, cement mills, and of course steel mills. Easton was a transportation hub which brought the steel to ports of Philadelphia, New Jersey into New York. They also brought coal down from the coal region to fuel this great machine here. I grew up in this region, and the landscape is filled with these incredible industrial machines that are, for me, like awe-inspiring cathedrals. Our office is based in Bethlehem. We do work as far as the Midwest, as south as the Carolinas. a lot of cultural projects for private sector, college and university, as well as nonprofits. And our work aims to be authentic, using materials harvested from the land. And our position in this discussion is from a planning perspective only. We're going to talk about some case studies here, small scale, as well as the Arts Quest Center. Of course, post-industrial landscapes are incredible opportunities. This is our history. This is as important to us as the Acropolis is, as the Pantheon is, as the Great Pyramids are. This is our industrial history, and we need to preserve this and repurpose these great machines. And of course, Kevin alluded to leadership. Leadership is critical, not only from your planning perspective, but local government as well as state government and the nonprofit groups. The leadership is paramount. We're going to talk about 4 case studies very quickly. First is an example of public-private partnership at Lafayette College in Easton. The second image is what's happening in the steel mill beyond Arts Quest right now, project in the planning process right now. And the next image is of a 19th century silk mill in Easton, Pennsylvania, which is in its incubation planning stage right now. I'm going to talk through the process about what it takes to sort of get a community excited about a project. And lastly, the Arts Quest Center. This is a visual arts building in downtown Easton. Lafayette College, many colleges in smaller cities, in urban areas, begin to feel bound by their site. It's an opportunity for them to move down into the city. And many cities have these sort of low-road former auto dealerships, auto service stations that are now kind of abandoned. And the college brought down their arts program, visual arts, performing arts, and we repurposed this building for them. And we actually saved the entire structure of the building, peeled the exterior envelope, inserted a new structure around the perimeter, and now it's a visual arts, performing arts complex. And what's really interesting at this particular part of the city, in the evenings, such as tonight, there might be a performance. The college students will put on a show, and the seating is very flexible. Lighting is on stanchions. Stage is very flexible. The outdoor performance becomes very dynamic, and it's a very vibrant and very vibrant place within the city. This is the office complex of the former Bethlehem Steel. On the Bethlehem Steel site, this was designed by McKim, Mead, and White in the early 1900s. Very, very opulent use of materials, opulence inside and out. And it was built over phases from the early 1900s to the 1950s. And we're currently working on the image. We're currently working on the building on the left, which housed in the 1950s Bethlehem's supercomputer. So you imagine what that beast looked like. It occupied the majority of this building. Today our computers are on our phones, but they had offices around the perimeter and this just mammoth computer system in the center of it. We're also going to be we're into a housing study for the office right now. So in a sense, the cultural impetus of this was the Arts Quest Center, but now we're bringing more vitality to this site by bringing business and housing into the site. So we talk about culture. Business is our culture as well, and businesses are innovative. Business can be artistic. We're making this building that once housed supercomputers a place for people now, a business incubator. And we do this it has a giant floor plate, so we carve a big hole in the middle of it so that everybody has access to daylight. This is a silk mill project in downtown Easton. It's a very massive complex of buildings, and it could be daunting as a nonprofit group to look at this thing and to wonder, how do you plan this? And what we see, this is an area that's basically fenced off from the community. But once you get in there, you see that these buildings were truly form follows function in their truest sense. They had narrow floor plates. They were sustainable and green buildings before sustainability and green became a buzzword. Everything that was designed here made sense, and it was all in the interest of producing silk. So we look at highest and best use for particular buildings. Where do we want civic moments? Where do we want highly public moments? Where do we want private? And we begin to zone we create a zoning map for potential investors and developers. These buildings are unbelievable, sort of cathedrals of industry. As you get in there, their structure made sense. Again, they ventilated themselves, ample window fenestration for light, and incredible structures, big open floor plates. So we look at how to then logically divide those up into spaces. And we see some of the clusters that these buildings make. This is like a modern-day piazza. And you think about the piazza, it was usually at the base of a church, and it was for social discourse. Or you think of the ancient Greek agora, where a lot of discourse happened, and thinking, arts and science. And these buildings had courtyards, and we look to that history to help inform space. And then we try to bring purpose to these courtyards. So we also use art as a catalyst. I mean, the project, when it's complete, becomes a catalyst for redevelopment, but we use art and artists as a catalyst to get the project going. We invite the public into these spaces and regional artists to begin to exhibit. We have impromptu exhibits in these spaces, and the community begins to realize the great potential that exists here. This is Stephen Antonakis. Your local and regional artists generally have ties to international giants. And we got our friends from the community had access to Stephen Antonakis, so we get him in to the site to do a branded moment. And one of the moments, there was a smokestack to put some of his neon art on there to create a destination. Easton is also a burgeoning community of filmmakers. We have some international and national filmmakers here, but we also have a lot of talented local filmmakers. So we put on a film festival every fall in September, and the culinary artists come in here, bring food, and this is, again, another way of bringing regional and some national attention to the site. So that brings us to Arts Quest, and for me, this was an incredible opportunity to make a place that I was inspired by and only saw from a distance as a kid. I remember seeing these, wherever you are in the Lehigh Valley, you see these great machines, and I am so honored and thrilled and grateful that our civic leaders decided to preserve this part of our history. And our intent was to make a place that was equally as strong, quiet, yet unyielding to these great blast furnaces, a place that kind of resonates with the history of that place, and a building that celebrates how it's made through its parts. Every public room has a view out to the furnaces. The performances essentially have a backdrop to the furnaces. And the outdoor places thrust themselves out onto the site. It becomes a wonderful marquee. If any of you have not been to the Lehigh Valley in a while, or have never been to the Lehigh Valley, you need to go to see what's happening there. Particularly in the summer, Arts Quest puts on a number of free music festivals, and there's music in the streets throughout this campus and music in the building. And as a design professional, this happens to be a bunker on the site. And we practice right in the middle of this site. We're in the middle of this brownfield, and we're inspired by these buildings. And this was actually electrical infrastructure for the Bethlehem steel plant, this giant 3 football field long by 16 foot wide bunker embedded into the landscape. And when we see stuff like this, we see incredible beauty, incredible potential. And this is the inside of that bunker. There's some holes in the surface of the earth that bring these incredible light streams down into the space. And you probably could see some galleries in Europe that are reminiscent of this kind of space. And that's the kind of beauty we see in these kind of low-road industrial buildings. Thank you so much.
So, hello, I'm Gina Reichert. I'm here from Detroit, Michigan, and I understand the National Building Museum has shown a couple of different photography shows over the past year, I think it's been. I see some nodding heads about Detroit and maybe some of the more grand abandonment and spectacle that gets shown a lot. I'm not going to talk about any of that, so I'm going to talk about our neighborhood. And I'd like to show this slide in part to show context, but also in part to show that that we're not dealing with the industrial sites that maybe Andrew Moore's photographs kind of highlighted, and we're not dealing with the type of landscape that we were just discussing, where there's sort of the one house on the urban prairie with nothing else around it. We really the work that Powerhouse Productions does and the artists that we work with do. It's in a neighborhood that, for Detroit, this is sort of our version of density. And the neighborhood was built up in the 1920s. It's almost entirely a single family freestanding houses. They're mostly wood frame. There are a couple brick corner stores and things scattered in between. But it's definitely housing stock that needs to be rethought for the 21st century. So a lot of what we do is try to rethink how these houses can be, how they can be renovated to make sense for the way we live today, but also in terms of the building technologies we have today, and also just how can we repurpose them, because really we have more housing stock than we know what to do with in our city, and that's citywide. And so a lot of it is about what does the neighborhood need, or what could serve the neighborhood, but it's always coming at it from the viewpoint of an artist or designer, because that's who we are and that's who we generally work with. The organization, Powerhouse Productions, gets its name from a project that is actually outside of the organization. The striped one on the left there is called the Powerhouse, and it's a project that Mitch and my partner Mitch Cope and I took on. I guess it's technically the first project house. So we moved into the neighborhood about 8 years ago, and we live in the neighborhood, and this was a property that we bought to use specifically as an experiment in what can we do with the houses, but also it's the first time we started investigating this idea of value in terms of the neighborhood and the house and project ideas. So if you can buy a house, well, not like this, it was in a different state, but if you can buy a house that's structurally sound, it has a decent roof, it's got a solid foundation, it's got hardwood floors and plaster walls, then you can buy that at the market price of $1,900, then what does that mean in terms of market value? And it just doesn't make any sense in terms of, it doesn't really make any logical sense. So one of the ideas that we investigate with Powerhouse is, what can we put back into the house that creates an inherent value that the market can't really take away from? So if the house is self-sustaining in terms of electrical and power needs, so it's got a wind turbine, and what you can't see on the south, this is the north side, on the south side there's a bank of solar panels. There's value in that I don't care what the realtor tells me or what the price goes up and down and fluctuation from year to year, because there's some kind of value in the fact that we're producing our own power for the house. So when I talk about value, it's sort of those kind of things. And then cultural value, we talk about a lot. And so this is the Powerhouse being used as a performance space last summer with a theater ensemble group called the Hinterlands. The Hinterlands Ensemble, who moved to the neighborhood a couple years ago. And now we're actually gutting and rehabbing a house to serve as their rehearsal and performance space, a small performance space, but a neighborhood-based performance space. So cultural value is another kind of way we use that word. And we talk about strategies a lot. So some of the strategies I think are similar to what Joseph was talking about. We have a property, we're not entirely sure what direction it's headed in, but how can you start to program it or activate it through the arts, regardless of anything else? So this house has no electric and no plumbing, but Corinne Vermeulen, who's a Dutch photographer who moved to Detroit for grad school and stayed, much as I did, she wanted to use the house as a portrait studio, a la the Walker Evans, like 5-cent portrait, if anybody here's a photographer. And so Corinne opened up this house, and it's a small house. It's one of the smallest houses in the neighborhood. But she set it up as a portrait studio and flyered the neighborhood, saying anyone who would like to come and have their portrait taken, please come and sit for your portrait. And so then I'll have this as a body of work, but then the following Saturday you can come back and I'll give you a print. So if you'd like to participate, that was sort of the exchange. And that's actually really key for a lot of the projects. It's one of the key strategies, I guess, that we try to implement, is that it's always a two-way exchange. It's never a one-way, here we are, look at what we do. It's always sort of, and this is what you get out of it. So this is one of our favorite things about this. There are actually about 40 portraits, and so it's this really great cross-section of who's in the neighborhood at this time and who was sort of open-minded enough to come and participate. And it was a very simple project and simple use of space. So through projects like the Powerhouse and Corinne's Photo Studio and a sort of series of small-scale initiatives, long before we formed an organization, but we caught the attention of Juxtapose magazine, and part of the relationship with Juxtapose magazine was fundraising, but it was also exposure on a national level, and I think more importantly, it's this idea of importing and exporting artists to and from the area. So again, as Joseph touched on, this idea of how do you get regional artists greater exposure, and then how do you bring in national artists who maybe already have a cash or a draw to their name, and how do those relationships develop? And again, to benefit both the artists here and there, just in terms of exposure and network and new bodies of work. So Juxtapose magazine, part of the fundraising effort that they put forth for us is that we would host 6 of their artists in residence. So in October 2010, we hosted a series of artists. So Swoon, Ben Wolf did this sort of architectural collage on the back of a fire-damaged house that the Hinterlands again used as a performance space. They really like to have performances in off-the-wall spaces. Monica Canaleo sort of created this architectural collage in a different way all over, inside and outside of this house. One of the great trajectories of this project is that Monica fell in love with the house, the project, and the city, and bought the house back from us. And so now it's in her hands, which is one of our favorite things, is to not own the houses too long, but turn responsibility, back over to someone else. It's sort of one of our economic sustaining models. We try not to hold too much property for too long. It's sort of always cycling. You just hold it long enough to get it back into a cycle of value and ownership. And then Soundhouse. So this was the artist that participated with Juxtapose. Soundhouse began, it's actually a little bit out of order. Retna and Richard Coleman are 2 California-based artists who came in with Juxtapose. And so the first phase of this house was really to take over the interior and exterior of the house and give it a new life in terms of painting. They'd never collaborated before, but they both really wanted to sort of take over this house with their painting. So they chose a simple color palette, black, white, and silver, and they just basically didn't leave the house for 2 weeks. And then the next phase of the project was actually how the house got its now name, Soundhouse. And John Brummett, who's a sound artist who moved into the neighborhood a few years ago, he walked into the house, saw the paintings that Richard and Retna did, and just sort of like heard them. He works with sound, so he started reading them as musical notations, and he created a sound piece specifically for the house that now when you walk in, it's triggered by sensors, and you kind of feel it too. He has this crazy bass system in the floor that shakes the wood, especially if you lay on the floor. But then the third phase of that is that the house becomes a very low-tech recording studio in itself. So now there's a performance series happening this year, where he's curating the series. He's inviting musicians in, and he's also creating his own pieces that are recorded on vinyl. If anyone remembers vinyl, and then there'll be a vinyl sound archive in the house, and then the equipment stays there for continued use. So, Soundhouse is a great example for us because it sort of has happened over a series of years. It's been slow to develop, but we like slow in Detroit. As I was saying before, slow means it usually sticks. Squash House is another project where artist Graham White, see the next one? Let's see, there's Graham. Artist Graham White has this idea about, he has a love for the sport of squash, but also the vegetable. So the inside, the inside of the house, which was fire damaged, is being gutted and is coincidentally the size of a regulation squash court. And so come fall of this year, you will be able to play squash inside of this house. But also, our neighborhood is made up majority of Bangladeshi immigrant families. Second and third generation now, the Bangladeshi started coming over in the 1970s for various reasons, and ended up settling in this neighborhood, and squash is the staple crop kind of all of their gardens. And squash that I had never seen before and didn't know the names of until I went into the grocery stores in the neighborhood. So this is Habib and his family who were our neighbors for a long time, and they live next to Squash House. So this is them anxiously waiting and putting a lot of pressure on us to get this project going. And then, Graham was just waiting for the game to start. So the big development this winter is that we got the paint job done, but again, through some of the grants and foundation money that we've been lucky to receive, we're doing the interior build-out this summer, I guess. And the back of the house, so the front of the house will be the squash court, the back of the house will be a greenhouse, and then the way back, which opens up onto an alley that the city doesn't maintain the alleys. They're not used for anything anymore. That'll be the trellis system where the squash thing can grow outside, and we're hoping to get the lot this summer or fall when it's up for tax auction, and then the balance between the vegetable and the sport will kind of become a little more even. And then the last project I'll talk about, it ties into Squash House in terms of, I guess, strategies and approaches and for the projects. It's really about community engagement on a level that doesn't even require programming necessarily. It just requires this space, the creation of a public space that members of the community and our fellow residents can call their own and really feel comfortable in. So whether they get the landscape design aspects or the contemporary art illusions, like Graham's making, because he's a sculptor and a designer, and the work that he does, that doesn't really matter if they're just coming to play the sport that they already are playing, or if they're coming to use the space in a way that makes sense to them. So Reichert Sculpture Park is a skate park. But we call it a sculpture park because we're really looking at ideas of alternative land use and how to use green space and smart design along an expressway. I guess that's an expressway that kind of divided up the neighborhood years ago. And so we spent last summer creating this phase 1 piece, which has a barbecue grill built in that has become very popular. But one of the great things about Reichert, and something we didn't really think of in terms of a strategy, is how the park would get misused in really interesting ways. For example, a couple of months ago, there was a rap video being shot there, which that was sort of a great measure of success for us when sort of the local music community took ownership of the park and deemed it cool enough to shoot a rap video there. That made us very happy. But also when we drive by, we don't organize these barbecues or anything like that. It's just people know that the facilities are there and they've come and really, again, taken ownership of the project. And one last thing I was going to say, maybe just about sports, recreation, and land use, or maybe just about the public space. It's really, the neighborhood, our neighborhood is a funny little corner of Detroit. It doesn't really have a name. It doesn't have any kind of an identity or signature to it. So I think some of the things we do with these houses and the public space or the vacant land projects is create some kind of anchor point in the neighborhood. And I think we're a little bit different in terms of strategies because we're not looking at sort of these large-scale institutions that are necessarily destination spots. We're really looking at a strategy of decentralization. So our approach is we don't expect our neighbors to necessarily stop what they're doing in their day-to-day lives and go down to the Museum of Contemporary Art for the programming there. We're interested in sort of a different level of accessibility where we, as working artists, are just sort of in their backyard because it's our backyard, and there's a strategy of just working in your own neighborhood and making the neighborhood a studio space, and integrating public art, contemporary art, and ideas about social practice, where people can sort of witness it for themselves. So that's sort of the level of community engagement that we work in. And I guess I don't have the map that shows how the sites are scattered, but we really do work in sort of like sorry to go back through. We're sort of all concentrated like in this half of the slide. So it's really in like a 6-block area, but scattered in that 6-block area. So again, one of the strategies we look at is how do we position these properties with, I mean, sometimes it's just, which houses are vacant that we can get our hands on, but sometimes it's really like, let's not concentrate too many of the artists' activity on one block. That block over there really needs some kind of active space to help stabilize it because a family moved away or there was an arson fire there. And so if we can get the property next to that fire damaged house and people see that it's become something else, or that there's a future trajectory that maybe is more on the positive upswing instead of a downswing, then how can that affect the whole block? And so we really look at this as integrating these active houses or active projects into the whole neighborhood, and not so much creating zones or districts or anything where there can be sort of defined an inside or an outside of the art activity. So those are some of our strategies, and I think I get to turn it over to you now for discussion.
Really great stuff.
It's really fun.
So you guys showed us 3 incredibly different places and very, very different responses to place. I think in all cases, place-based responses, in fact. But I heard a couple of commonalities, which is what I hope we'll talk about in the next half an hour before we turn it to you guys. First, it seems to me that all of these successes are a function of getting extraordinary individuals together. We can talk about organizations and partnerships of organizations, but these all depended on individuals, yourselves included in the number. And individuals who evinced qualities that I think all of you spoke about, most importantly, cooperation and leadership. And I guess I'd like to start there, rather than a big, long introduction. I'd like to start there. How do you identify people like that? What if for those of you who are thinking about your own communities, or I think about mine, what if you reflect on your community and you listen to these speeches and you say, well, the banks have totally left my community. There are no more local banks. The civic infrastructure that's so strong in Pittsburgh has disappeared. Or political leadership is so weak and so fractionalized, so unable to focus on a particular area. Everybody's focused on their district. They don't want to do citywide stuff. How do you identify and bring together the individuals who can actually lead, evince a vision that's compelling, and then cooperate?
I think ours is a little bit different because of the scale we work at. We work across an area that's decent size, but each of the projects is so small that we were able to sort of do the work first and look for support later. And so for us, it was maybe reversed. It was like who came out of the woodwork and found us after some of our projects were made public or were getting public attention, and we found allies that way. So. It really started because because we were living in this neighborhood already, the projects came later, and they were just self-initiated projects because, you know, Mitch's background is in studio art and mine's in architecture, and we were looking at how we could do work, or what kind of work were we going to do if we were going to stay in Detroit. You know, like what would make it worth staying there for? Like what unique opportunities are there that maybe aren't in New York? And so we sort of did the work in the projects first, and, you know, never had an ambition to create an organization or lead, you know, anything or anywhere.
You just did.
We just did, yeah. And then it really was people sort of popping up on our doorstep, or, you know, sending emails or making phone calls with expressed interest. And then you start sort of teaming up or making partnerships or finding opportunities to work together, or yeah. So I think our process is probably a little bit more backwards, bottom up instead of top down.
That's interesting, though. In answer to your question, Candace, those kind of leaders bubble up, and you begin to see them at the public venues, you see them at the zoning meetings, and they're generally fired up about what they do, and they believe in what they do. Arts Quest organization started out as a party in the streets in the mid-'80s, where the founder, Jeff Parks, convinced some local city leaders that he wanted to close down 4 blocks in Bethlehem and serve beer and have music for the community. And it just grew from that to where now they've taken over a produce warehouse for community arts, and their latest is the Arts Quest Center. And you do have to just kind of do it. Innovation happens when you do it, and you don't talk about it, you just do it. Where our office is a big proponent for that as well.
Certainly Pittsburgh, there's a lot of just do it. When you think about when the Cultural Trust was created, it was the time that the steel industry was leaving. So about half of the population of Pittsburgh left during the, if you will, the early 80s, early to mid 80s. So at the very time that the city was looking like it was going down for the final count, this group of civic leaders basically said, let's try this. And, you know, one of the interesting things is that we all know that not everything works out according to plan. Jack Hines, who was in that video, his plan was to build if you will, a Kennedy Center, a Lincoln Center on one of the bluffs overlooking the downtown for his beloved Pittsburgh Symphony. That's what he really wanted to do. And had actually talked about buying the land, and he had the resources through the Hines Endowments to do this, but he couldn't get the sort of collaboration that was needed, and essentially that part of the plan failed. That never happened. There's some actually beautiful renderings that I got when I joined the trust. These beautiful, beautiful buildings, modernist buildings. None of them ever saw the light of day, and instead was able to repurpose some of these old movie houses that had been not torn down, thank goodness, and being able to renovate those and creating this kind of cultural district. So I would agree with what everyone said, though, that there's a lot of self-identification. Leaders come into being, and fortunately, a lot of our cities do have those leaders, but it does really start there. Someone has to say, let's do this.
There was a phrase that you used in your presentation where you said everything we do is a two-way exchange, which I thought was great, because one of the other things I think that we all assumed we were going to talk about is partnerships, and it's clearly, it was a commonality running through your presentations, that all of these projects are partnerships among institutions, or groups of artists, residents, the foundation community, businesses, developers, arts institutions. And I think that, at least in my business, when you start talking about these partnerships, we talk about making it win-win for everybody and showing everybody why it's in their best interest to be a partner. But I'm interested in the other part of it. What are the obligations of the partners? What should we expect from government, from not-for-profit institutions, from artists? when do we know? How hard should we be pushing at what issues when we put together these kinds of partnerships? And I think maybe I'll ask you to start, Kevin.
Well, I think clearly, you mentioned government, for example. So when the Cultural Trust was created, the government was a little busy at the moment trying to hold the city together from utter collapse. So they were very happy to have this mostly private group of citizens create this new interest in revitalizing the downtown. From the very beginning, though, that relationship was one of, as Gina said, this two-way relationship. We're going to create and support a cultural district, which is going to help the arts groups, both large and small, and at the same time, that will help the economic development side of private interests, real estate holders, industry, business. It will keep those organizations vital downtown. So there was a kind of both relationships, and from the point of view of the patron, the individuals, they were going to get a very convenient, first-class space to enjoy art of all kinds. So that's how I would see that coming in all those different directions. The citizens were getting a place that they could come to and be entertained. The arts groups were getting first-class places to create art, and the city and business interests were, probably in a very self-evident way, downtown was being revitalized.
And so what do they give back?
The they?
Well, let's say the city. I mean, how has the city participated in the district?
Well, I was trying to be polite a minute ago and say that the city was preoccupied with other things.
And I'm going to push.
That's fine, Ken. And every city is different. I mean, Miami Performing Arts Center was just opened a couple years ago, and I think it's about a $380 million facility. $250 million was public money. The Cultural Trust and the theaters received, out of the approximately $220-some million sort of to date investment, probably less than $10 million of that was real public money. Almost all of it was private money in one way or another. And Pittsburgh's admittedly has a legacy of great private foundations that, from the wealth that was created a century ago. The industries have left, but the wealth that was created there is largely remaining. So I think the city clearly is getting a lot of income tax. They're getting a lot of real estate tax. They're getting a lot of parking tax. All of those things are being generated by what we do on a daily basis. So they are benefiting.
If I could add to that, Pennsylvania, during the Rendell administration, has set up a number of grant and tax relief programs for this very redevelopment of our industrial corridor. They've also set up things to preserve open space so that people go back into the cities. And we've been very fortunate to have all those grants in place over the last almost decade, which helped a lot of these projects come to fruition. Also, we've had great local government support. All the cities cooperate with one another. The mayors are just thinking about the future of their city that they'll leave behind and the place they want to leave it in. So in terms of contributing, I think we all have an obligation to contribute in any capacity we feel we can, whether it be volunteering or supporting the arts organizations.
So I think Detroit is maybe in the situation that you were describing as Pittsburgh when this started, but the city doesn't have anything to offer in terms of financial. I mean, there aren't grants or tax breaks for the neighborhoods anyway. There might be for downtown, and there might be for like what's labeled the entertainment district or the casinos or Midtown, where there's a lot of investment dollars. But the problem with that is that Detroit is mostly made up of neighborhoods. So if you, again, we were talking about the geographic makeup of it. If you look at the map of Detroit, you know, the part where all those investment dollars in is like this big. and the rest of the city is all neighborhood-based. Now, a lot of the foundations have come forward, so Spillman or Kellogg or Ford or Knight and Kresge and so on. But and that's great. But again, I think if you're sort of in a smaller community or neighborhood where things aren't happening yet, it's very easy to feel like you're being overlooked, and these models maybe don't make sense to you or you can't relate. I think that's why we're very happy working at the smaller scale, because I think some of the strategies or the projects we've initiated do work at that scale. And whether they should or can be replicated in other parts of the city, I'm not sure, but I think they give an example of how you don't need $1 million tax break from the governor that you're never going to get at, talking about the areas where we're working in, which again makes up most of the city of Detroit. Now, I will say the mayor's office has been very receptive and very supportive publicly and in newspapers and writing letters of support for grants we've applied for, so they can offer those kinds of things. I mean, we know that they don't have money to offer, or they don't even have really resources to offer. They don't even have like people in their offices to offer because the staffing is being cut so drastically. But they own a lot of land that they don't necessarily want to own, and they're at a point where they're very open to new ideas. Because so many are needed. It's sort of, the city's in such a point of crisis in some ways that they're very willing and eager to listen to any harebrained
And I would
idea
chime in. I think
you
Pittsburgh
might
was
put
the
in front of
same,
them.
exactly the same way. It wasn't that the city was in any way against what the Cultural Trust was trying to do. They were extremely grateful and supportive, but they really didn't have any financial capacity, and largely still don't.
But sometimes the problem is they also don't have a clue or a vision.
Right.
Well, at least in our case, I mean, I think we were very blessed that we had a number of very enlightened political leaders. One of them, long-term Mayor Tom Murphy, who was really very enlightened and pushed through a number of major projects, both from a kind of civic as well as sort of privately based. And he was one of the people that said, "Let's just do it." And that made a big difference. When the mayor of a city of Pittsburgh says, go do it, that made a difference. He sometimes did that, and other people didn't want him to do it, but that's a different story.
These projects resulted in very different places, and in real change to neighborhoods and central business districts, and I think all fabulous. It's hard to believe that everybody welcomed change. There's a gentleman in your video who said this was the worst block in Pittsburgh, and perhaps it was, but I suspect some of the landlords and tenants there were less convinced.
I used to say that there was a lot of entertainment going on in the cultural district, just a different kind of entertainment, for sure.
But how do you deal with that? How do you talk to people about change? And I was looking at the slide that you had of your neighbors at the squash house, and so amused and pleased that the end of that story was that they're welcoming the squash house.
Oh yeah, I mean the plan for, again, we're barely an organization, but so in terms of like staffing or open hours, the plan is for them to be the key holders, so that if people come to the house and want to play, or it's mostly in terms of residents who want to come and play at the house, then they can go and get the key from Habib is basically the plan. And then we'll have open hours for public, because we are starting to walk this weird line between destination spot and what's for residents and the like influx of other people. But not the biggest resistance we've come up against are criminals. So like I got a metal scrapper yelled at me the other day and told me to like go back across 8 Mile, which is outside of the city, which I've never lived, but that's okay. It's sort of like this reverse racism that was, because he was mad at me for telling him not to scrap this refrigerator. But so there's in Detroit, this discussion of like who is against change or gentrification, it's a funny one because our neighborhood is so far from any of that it's difficult for me to speak about. There are other areas of the city where I can see how that conversation is maybe more applicable, and even there it's like, yes, but if these investment dollars don't come in, then what's the other story, or what's the other trajectory for this neighborhood? And if there's a different one, that's great, but for 50 years now, a lot of these areas have been very stagnant, and we're just losing building stock. So it's still very difficult to sort of say that I'm against that sort of destination burger restaurant that a lot of suburbanites come to, because wouldn't you rather just take their money at this point? Like, I mean, it's hard. It's a difficult conversation because there's the issue of displacement is a little bit tricky because, well, I don't know. It's a funny discussion because sometimes the thing getting displaced is the criminality, and all of the residents in our neighborhood want that. And I think it really becomes more of an issue of quality of life and quality of what housing stock is there. So if sort of one area gets built up or renovated to such an extent that there's a clear dividing line where it sort of drops off and there's nothing happening across that street or across that road, that the discrepancy there is a problem. So people talk about two neighborhoods in Detroit, specifically Midtown and Corktown, when they talk about gentrification, and I think it's that issue, that there's so much money and attention being put into this one small area that what happens just like outside that periphery. And I think that's a valid question. If you're not talking about the health of the city overall or strategies to improve the health of the different neighborhoods throughout the city, then what about the quality of life issues for those other residents?
Mm-hmm.
The acceptance of change is a product of the particular environment. And you mentioned gentrification. That's an interesting word that you could connotate with for the common good, or I look at gentrification as sort of a homogenization or a beautification for the masses, which sometimes is not always good. And change in those type of environments, they'll be more resistant rather than change in sort of a low-road district where no one's really paying attention to it until it begins to become vibrant.
I think in our neighborhood, ownership is what maybe keeps me from worrying about those things. Like most of the families or the residents in the neighborhood own their property. So everyone is kind of hoping that the property values go up. Otherwise, they all talk about moving out or, we're still losing residents. The typical foreclosure crisis story, people are leaving houses because they can pay cash for less than what is owed on their mortgage. So some people are just moving across the street or down the block. So we deal more with like neighborhood stabilization issues than sort of outside displacement or the homogenization. And the trick with gentrification is always that once that homogenization happens, usually the people who were there in the first place don't even want to stay because the character is lost.
Right.
So it's really about maintaining the character of the place.
Gentrification, though, is, we've seen some of that now as a result of people wanting to live downtown. Mm-hmm. And we've spent a fair amount of time with various community leaders and even talking among ourselves about how we deal with that. We put up a new, not directly, but through a partnership, a new high-rise apartment building right in the cultural district. And sort of market rate, did it because a lot of people said it couldn't be done. It was the first new multifamily housing that had occurred in the Golden Triangle of downtown Pittsburgh in 38 years, so there were a lot of naysayers. It did lease up right away and at market rates for Pittsburgh, which was really remarkable. However, we became concerned about, well, if that becomes a trend, and it's started to slowly, where would the artists live? Where would other people be able to, would they be able to afford to live there? So we've worked now with a number of other developers to build, and mostly in repurposing existing buildings for what we would call more affordable rate rentals. So right now we're about 50-50 in terms of right downtown, which is pretty remarkable for a city like Pittsburgh to have that kind of balance. And we're watching it. I mean, we don't have any legal authority. We don't have any direct control over zoning, but we can certainly influence what does take place. And I think that is something that we all have to be concerned about in terms of as change takes place. The little restaurant owner that's been there forever and now sees 2 million people coming into the district, and he can't renew his lease because some fancy restaurant now wants to lease his space to better make more money for him as opposed to this other operator that may have been there for 20 years.
But it seems to me that it's a delicate balance.
It is.
That at the same time that, I mean, so many of these projects are about moving forward but remaining authentic and respectful.
To my knowledge, we didn't have too many tears for getting rid of some of that stuff. There probably were some.
But I mean, you've all talked about respecting our history while moving forward, and authenticity has emerged. And I think all of us who grew up I'm from Pittsburgh originally, I was telling Kevin, and am at heart a Northeasterner. We read about reurbanization and the city's cores are getting healthier and downtown residential. There's just an article last week, I think in Atlantic City, which one of you may have seen, that says that that's mostly romance, that the data suggests that we are continuing to move south, southeast and southwest to cities that sprawl, and continuing, to the extent that we can, to buy houses in the cities that sprawl and are car dependent. I'm curious whether you think there's any evidence that investment in these kinds of projects and in this kind of cultural investment in cities makes them more competitive, stronger cities.
I think it's huge. Certainly in Pittsburgh's case, it's just remarkable what that 14-city block redevelopment has spawned. Literally billions of additional dollars of investment, private investment and some government investment that has taken place all around where the cultural district once was. And some of those projects are, as I said, government-related, convention center, sports stadiums, but others are huge office towers and building that would not have taken place if downtown looked the way it did 20 or 25 years ago. So I think in that sense, certainly it has worked.
From a personal perspective, excuse me, as an architect, I wanted to build my own place. You had to do it in the suburbs when you make your own place, and it was about making a typology in a suburb. Once our kids are grown in college, we intend to move back into the city. And I know many of my friends, my professional friends who have done the same, are interested in kind of getting back to the city, into a walkable community where you could do your grocery shopping, live, work, play in one kind of 1 mile radius. So I don't have any statistics on whether that's happening or not, but that is my personal desire. And to be in a more of a diverse community. I'm out in the vanilla suburbs right now, and that's not always as stimulating as being in a cultural core.
I would just to add to it quickly, I think that investment in the arts and cultures instigates growth as much as investment in infrastructure or investment in medical districts. To me, it's I feel like I've been saying quality of life a lot, but it comes back to that quality of life issue, and that if people aren't investing in arts and culture or aren't including that layer of a city in some way, in whatever planning or investment dollars that are being sought, then just the quality of life and the balance of it all gets thrown out of whack. And so to me, it's not about attracting the creative class. I don't really buy into that argument at all. But it's really about just fulfilling that piece of the puzzle that I think we all have. And so for some people, it's heightened. If you work in the arts, or if you are an artist, or if you're a dancer or musician, then maybe it takes on a different priority. But to me, it's the same as building hospitals or building bridges or whatever. It's just it's all part of the health of any place. So if you start to cut those things out, I think you're doing the citizens a disservice in a big way.
Scott.
Certainly infrastructure is the big buzz.
Yes.
Updating our infrastructure is a big buzzword today, and yes, it's important. But you don't go visit a place because of its infrastructure. You visit a place because of its vibrancy and its cultural core it's museums, it's music, it's schools. That's why you visit a place, and you assume when you visit that place, its infrastructure is fine.
Scott had given me a list of questions that he suggested we conclude with before we open it to you guys. So I will ask you the one, because I want to give these guys some time, that I thought was most fun. So here we are in Washington, D.C., so somebody out there in that audience may be an influential policymaker. If you, before, just, a sentence or two, if there's something that you would like to tell federal policymaker about how they can help advance these kinds of community-based initiatives, what would it be?
I would look to Pennsylvania and what the Rendell administration has done to help these kind of communities and these kind of distressed areas, provide grant money to allow these projects to flourish. I would look to those examples as a case study and to check on them periodically to see how they're succeeding and how the policy worked out for that particular region.
I think I would tell them that they should include artists and designers in their process earlier on and more often, maybe. People are always hiring consultants, but a lot of times if you find artists and designers who are working in that community already, that they already have that information for you. And I think if there was a way to open up the offices so that, I don't know if there's more transparency or just more approachability in terms of lawmakers or idea generating or, and like really in that kind of insight into the development of an area. I think that they'd be surprised at how well they could all work together if they just sort of opened up the channels.
One of my biggest concerns is that there are, I think, some people out there that think that sort of the whole basis of nonprofits needs to be rethought. And I'm certainly not opposed to increasing accountability and making sure that nonprofits are really doing what they need to do. But I do worry that sometimes people misinterpret. And we see this locally when we're talked about in terms of tax-exempt organizations. They don't pay their own way. Why is that? I would say that that's a big concern for all of us in our country, and to make sure that we recognize that there is a partnership relationship there. What we're doing, we're providing, and this is really one of your first questions, is what's the give back? We're providing a lot of energy and a lot of support and a lot of revenue, and we're doing it largely on a private basis. Obviously, tax incentives provide help, but as we think about eliminating some of those incentives, potentially, I think that can be a problem.
Questions? Yes, sir. Green shirt.
Hi. Thanks so much for your time, your information, and everything you provided. I just put a quick plug in. I think the best defense I've ever heard of infusing the arts into public policy was given last night by Yo-Yo Ma at Americans for the Arts annual lecture on public policy and the arts. It's stunning. It's available on YouTube. So that's just one thing. The question I have is, I'm concerned about actually loss of industrially zoned land. One of the first things we do when we want to infuse a place with new life is we rezone the industrial land to mixed use. Think we're going to have the restaurants, the cultural center, the retail, and the residential, but we do need industrial land. And so, I'm working on a strategy to actually limit how much can go into industrial zoned land, but allow these things. Do you think what are your ideas on how to save industry as a piece of our economic portfolio for different areas, along with the arts?
We certainly become a new kind of industrial country. We do less manufacturing now, more innovation, more thinking. In our region of the Lehigh Valley, back in the 70s, the civic leaders kind of took that next step, what's going to happen after Bethlehem Steel, and they set out industrial parks throughout the Lehigh Valley, large areas of land for this new industry to happen. So the civic leaders in that area already had planned for that, and now we have a series of industrial parks that are actually flourishing right now. These particular industrial zones that we're making mixed use right now, they're, in terms of producing or manufacturing, they're a bit archaic. They're more sculptural kind of elements now that lend themselves to our now part of our history, and for people to see and interact and move around these things and have mixed uses on site. I don't know if I answered your question.
I think it's an excellent question, though, because certainly in Pittsburgh, there's a lot of debate still to this day talking about that very subject. And similarly to what you were saying, Joe, and we've seen repurposing of some of these plants to, again, reuse them for industry. There are more people working now in the Pittsburgh region than there were at the height of the steel industry. But it's a very diversified economy now, unlike what it was 20 years ago. So there is still a lot of activity going on, including a fair amount of manufacturing activity. It's just a different kind.
Well, and just to add, I mean, I don't really know much about the industrial zoning issues in Detroit. I just know we have a lot of industrial land that nothing's happening on. We have a lot of contaminated land that, the last industry didn't clean up. So I would say bring your industry to Detroit because we've got room. So
my question is actually about Detroit. I was a resident there myself for some time, and there was a lot of other organizations that had been there for a number of decades or years. And I'm speaking of groups like led by Grace Lee Boggs or Tyree Guyton with Heidelberg Project, or John Grichala, who did a lot of urban farming projects in Detroit. So my question to you is about how interactive have you been with other organizations prior to your 8 years there, and to what extent are you coordinating with them or networking with them on your projects?
yeah, it's tricky in Detroit because like John's land isn't that far from us, but I think what happens with a lot of us there is we kind of hunker down in our own little corner. And we get sort of too busy and overstretched to even like go the mile up the road to see how he's doing. But it's a small enough community that we all cross paths a lot. So Grace Lee Boggs is still doing well, and they're actually opening a school, or the Boggs Educational Center is opening a school, which sounds really exciting. They're trying to get off the ground this fall. That we, not as Powerhouse Productions, but as Design 99 might be involved with, just if they need design services, simple things. But we've kind of all crossed paths over the year. I mean, Tyree is a project, and the Heidelberg Project is something that we look at, as definitely a predecessor. But the same way we would look at like Rick Lowe and Project Row House in Houston, or maybe more of a contemporary what Theaster Gates is doing in Chicago. And we just look at them as sort of almost case studies or what we can learn from. Rick's actually going to be in Detroit on Friday. It's a small enough community that we end up being very aware of what one another's doing, but it doesn't always mean that we can work together. I don't know, just. Well, so there's this interesting plan that came out. The powers that be were creating this new plan for the city, and the whole process was called Detroit Works. It was branded very well, but there are a lot of missteps. But I think in the end, it actually is a good model for how citizens can be involved in a citywide planning process. And although the first round of meetings, there was a lot of yelling and fighting, it turned into something very productive in the end. It just sort of had to like work its kinks out. And it was a very sort of open attempt, or an attempt at a very open way of making policy. And so this crazy telephone book now is out called Detroit Future City, or the Detroit Future Plan. And again, it's sort of a lot for any layperson to digest. I mean, it's a lot for me who's like, been trained to digest. I have a hard time getting through it. But the fact that the work's all there and the closeness at like the ground level was, like, that study was done. And it is implementing a lot of interesting alternative ideas about what does it mean to be in a city like this? Does a city mean density? Is that what defines a city? And how do you allow green space in? So neighborhoods like Brightmoor on the west side, everyone's being very honest about what can happen to that land there, and what does land use mean in Brightmoor, which is, it's almost rural in large areas, like for miles, versus, what does land use mean in the entertainment district by the stadiums. So it's nice to see that things were looked at that closely and broken down. And I know, Tyree and the Heidelberg's project history with the city has gone through such a crazy swing and roller coaster over the years from, for those of you who don't know the project, previously the city was looking to they tore down and brought lawsuits against this artist who was taking over houses and making them into sort of art spectacles. That's totally turned around, and now all kinds of foundations and the University of Michigan planning is involved in sort of how does the Heidelberg project sort of take on the next phase, which I think Tyree and everyone's ready for. Sort of the art spectacle houses were one thing for decades, and what can grow out of that. So I think people have looked at those projects as case studies. Grace Lee Boggs, who's now 95, I think, she still writes every week and publishes and speaks, and everyone's just hoping she holds on for as long as she can because she's such a progressive force to be reckoned with. So we're sort of all aware of each other. I think we all learn a lot from each other. I think we kind of leave it to like other powers that be to create the models or the case studies from these examples.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, hi.
Okay.
My name is Kimberly Driggins, and I'm with the DC Office of Planning. And it's more of a statement, or I don't know how many folks are in DC, but we have a lot of stuff going on. While I appreciate what Pittsburgh and Detroit are doing, I just really want to call out what Washington is doing. We're doing a lot of positive things. And I see Deirdre, who's with the city of Arlington now, but she was also with DC Arts and Humanities Commission. And Washington is really, I think, on the cutting edge of a lot of work around creative placemaking. Both the DC Arts and Humanities Commission and DC Office of Planning, those are just two agencies, have very robust public, DC Arts and Humanities Commission has a very robust public arts program. What the Office of Planning, we do a lot of planning work that supports creative placemaking. We've had one grant from Art Place America, and we have Liz Crane, who's with that organization. And we really do a lot with participatory placemaking. And, I would encourage folks to sort of, look in their own backyard. Washington is doing a lot of work. You can find a lot of information on our website. We're managing a lot of plans that have cultural and arts components to that, and we're really trying to kind of rethink how we think about the arts and culture in DC. In addition to the wonderful institutions such as the Kennedy Center, Smithsonian, we're also doing some other things that are getting outside of the institutions and really sort of bringing arts and culture into the neighborhoods and on the streets. So I just wanted to kind of call that to everyone's attention.
Thank you. Yes, the Paisley. And then the last or next to last? Next to last. Okay.
Thank you. So building on Josh's question about how to retain industrial use, with creative placemaking, how do we go beyond seeing artists as the shock troops, and preserve some sort of social equity in the process of creative placemaking, but also preserve the zoning for the cultural uses that transformed a place like Detroit? Because what you're doing now may create value 20 years from now so that folks like yourself can't afford to live there anymore. So is there something, while you said leave the policy to others, is there something that you can do to stay part of the conversation to make sure that the zoning stays inclusive to future cultural use?
Yeah, I mean, we've actually had some very interesting conversations about zoning in our neighborhood because we're not zoned for any of this. So, so we play a really delicate balancing act of what is below the radar and what's above the radar. And so, but which is why it's strange that, you know, we get letters of support from the mayor's office for the skate park. But we kind of have like, we pick and choose what we tell them and when. We play kind of a dancing game about that. But we also, but again, Detroit is also at a point where they're really very open to things. So, you know, like 20 years ago, John Grugello's farms probably would have gotten shut down, you know, his soy field. But now it's like part of the master plan. So it's like come a long way slowly but surely. And they kind of, everyone in the office kind of knows that they're coming around slow and they're playing catch up, but they're also being very smart, I have to say, and sensitive about like, okay, so you want to maybe rezone this from strictly residential to mixed use, but what does that open up? You know, if one of your neighbors decides that that means they want to put a used car lot on that block, we have to let them if we do A, B, and C. So, I mean, we actually are in conversation, and they have a very open door policy about, you know, what this all means long-term and big picture. So 20 years from now, what is happening, you know, just because we're sort of, people see us as quirky and we're getting attention now, it doesn't mean that long-term that can't get reversed. And I still think the best way to ensure that we're not all getting priced out is ownership. And we can play that game in our neighborhood because you can buy houses for very little. Now, the houses you buy for very little need lots of work. But you know, no one's coming into our neighborhood and flipping properties. It's just, it's not a money-making investment strategy right now. So part of what we do, honestly, is market. I mean, I think you guys probably all
the key is ownership. I think, you know, really that's, and again, that's a struggle, because if you're trying to renovate a gallery or a theater and at the same time trying to buy 4 or 5 empty lots next door, you know, there's internal conflict within the organization. But if you don't do it then, you're not going to be able to afford to do it later. And I think that was the secret of the cultural trust, for sure.
Yeah, if the restaurant owner owned that restaurant,
yeah,
he wouldn't have to leave.
Exactly.
Right. Somebody came else. Right.
You mentioned that no one's coming in buying and flipping houses, but are you prepared for that to happen one day? Because it is going to become a destination. I know you didn't intend for that to be, but that's how these things evolve. And an example of this is on a big scale that we're all familiar with is Soho. How Soho was this low-road district, desolate area in the 60s and 70s. Artists started squatting and occupying and making art in Soho. It all of a sudden became a cool destination. Gentrification came into play and pushed the artists out into Chelsea. And now you begin to see Chelsea getting gentrified as well. So I think the question is a great one. I don't have the answer, but it's something we really need to pay attention to.
I think the gentleman in the corner has the last question. I bet many of us would stay for those of you who want to talk.
Well, first of all, I'm a local artist, entrepreneur, and innovator and advocate for the arts. And I'd like to thank you all for sharing the information. It's very relevant to what I'm working on right now. Actually, in Ward 8, the community is facing a lot of social issues that you discussed as far as displacement, gentrification. It's one of the highest unemployment rate. And I've seen from a different perspective. I was a board member of the Arts and Humanities Commission. I chair Councilmember Bird's Arts and Culture Committee, and I have a business around design. One of the things that we're working on that's important to us is economic inclusion principles, because when people do invest, it's not about gentrification. You know, the displacement means that you weren't included in the development process. And those are some of the kind of things we work on. So I have to ask you 2 things. One is, have you conducted a comprehensive evaluation of what you've been through and accomplishing your goals and your projects? And if so, I'd like to get access. And 2, who's familiar with artist co-ops? I'm working with a guy from, he's from Babson and Harvard, and works at Georgetown Law. We're working at UDC to actually revise the policy in DC around worker co-op, so it would be easier to start an artist co-op in the District of Columbia. Have you used that model? Are you familiar with that model? And what do you think about how it applies to making successful businesses in the creative economy?
I think there are a couple of interesting models in Detroit. So one is this building called Pony Ride that I'm not sure if it's exactly a co-op in the way you're talking, but it's shared building, shared resources. But in terms of like investment and development dollars, I think it's mostly a few people, but it's very much about shared ownership of the space and the facilities. So it's a newer space. But yeah, so Pony Ride would be something to look into. But we've only really been around as an organization for 4 years now. So we haven't evaluated much of it.
We have 3 projects that I'm aware of in Pittsburgh that are I don't know if they're legally co-ops, but they are very similar to what you would, I think, describe as an artist co-op. All 3 of them are involving not only workspace but also living space. And they've all repurposed existing buildings. I think 2 of them are working out reasonably well. One of them, I'm not sure, is going to make it in the long run, as much from an economic point of view as it is the artists getting along and working. We have a number of programs in the cultural district where we are the landlord and we are providing performance spaces for multiple users, and they tend to be very small users and highly subsidized users. So we serve more as a referee than we do as a landlord among those different groups. And I'd be happy to talk to you about that after if you want.
There's a brand new organization in New York City called Spaceworks, where the city has created a new not-for-profit that's going to identify blocks of space in which artists can work together and small cultural organizations can co-locate, particularly for office space, and share some expenses, and the city will guarantee the leases. So the not-for-profit finds the space, finds the tenants, and then the city stands behind the obligation to pay the rent. So the landlord will actually make the space available to organizations that otherwise might be viewed as too risky, and I could get you information about that. Thank you.